innovation and motorsport go together like milk and cookies, and no one is better at innovation than Lotus. Now, Lotus Engineering was actually founded in 1948 by Colin Chapman, a brilliant engineer, and his friend, Colin Dare. But we're going to skip ahead a few years to 1957, because they made some good cars in the 40s, but they weren't Lotus as we know of them today, so I'm going to skip to when they really got going, with the Lotus 7. This was a kit car, meaning they gave you the parts, you assembled it later. It cut costs, it saved tax dollars on the consumer, and it was just a better investment for a starting company. And despite its 40 horsepower engine, it was surprisingly fast. 0 to 60, 6.2 seconds. And once you got that 108 brake horsepower engine later on in the 7's run, it was real fast. Why? Well, it weighed just 1,100 pounds. The lightest car you can think of right now is probably one of the minis. Pretty solid, weighs just under 3,000 pounds. Yeah, it's twice as heavy. When a mini is twice as heavy as your car, that's pretty light. And then they had to sell the rights to the 7 in order to continue making money for their company, because they were in financial trouble. Which means, fun fact, the 7 is still produced today by Caterham. So there you go. And speaking of money, first vehicle to actually make a profit was the Elan. This was a gorgeous car designed by none other than legendary McLaren F1 designer Gordon Murray. This thing was light. It weighed just 1,500 pounds. And its 108 brake horsepower engine made 104 torque as well. And it pretty much immortalized everything about Lotus. Simplify, add lightness. But for being simple, it was rather complicated. It had 4-wheel disc brakes, high-tech suspension, and as a result, it was described as perfect in the steering department. Gordon Murray was quoted saying when he designed the Elan, the only thing that was different between the Elan and the McLaren in terms of design quality was the Elan had far better steering. And when your 1960s Lotus has quote-unquote perfect steering by the guy who made the McLaren F1 widely considered the best sports car of all time, that's a pretty big statement. And that allowed them to start building some new cars. The Esprit was introduced in 1976, and this is another legendary styling house. Giugiaro made this mid-engine rear-wheel drive road racer for Lotus, and it was an instant classic. Definitely helped by James Bond's submarine Lotus, Wet Willy, you know? When your car's in a James Bond film that can go underwater and shoot missiles, I think that boosts popularity a little bit. Also, it was rather quick. Even in the 1976 form, with 160 horsepower, it was respectably fast by that standard. But by the time it finished production in 2002, it was a monster. I'm talking 350 horsepower. Thanks to a twin-turbocharged V8 that did 0 to 60 in 4.3 seconds and had a top speed of 175 miles per hour. That means for 27 years, this was a serious supercar contender. But it wasn't enough to help the company, because by the 1980s, production had dropped by 75% thanks to a recession. And funnily enough, when you're in a recession, high grip sports cars are not exactly high on your priority list. But once they made the Turbo Esprit, things began to turn around. They shipped them over to the US, and US sales tripled overnight. And then things got even worse. The founder of Lotus, Colin Chapman, died in 1982 at the age of 54 from a heart attack. And some would call it fortuitous timing for Mr. Chapman because, this is real, he was being investigated by the British government for his involvement in the 1980s DeLorean bankruptcy scandal, which Lotus designed the chassis for. And it was quoted saying, if Chapman had been alive for the hearing, he would have served at least 10 years of prison. Yikes. Eventually, however, they did get a new chairman, which helped save the company altogether, and then it was later bought by GM subsidiaries in the 1980s for £23 million. Which brings us on to the modern day. I know I skipped over a lot of cars from Lotus history, however, there's so many different varieties, I focused on the key points that were highly influential to the company. So let's get back to the modern times. Kind of. Lotus Elise started production in 1998. It's a very old car. Didn't think about how old it was. And ever since, its 118 horsepower engine has been an underdog of all underdogs. Because, well, no one expects 118 horsepower to do any good, but thanks to its 1,500 pound curb weight, it could do 0 to 60 in 5.8 seconds. Then the Series 2 came out, and it was even faster. It was 218 horsepower. 0 to 60 in 4.3 seconds and a top speed of 150 miles an hour, which sounds terrifying in a little Elise. Have you seen an Elise? It makes a hatchback look massive. That sounds terrifying. And the Series 3 is the current gen Elise. And the top of the top tier is the Club 250 model. This thing has a boosted 243 horsepower and it weighs just 1,900 pounds. Meaning 0 to 60 in 3.9 seconds. But, come on, this is Lotus we're talking about. Acceleration isn't even their first priority. We all know that Lotus is a handling business, and it was rather good at that. The Elise was universally acclaimed for its impressive and nimble handling, and it won Top Gear's Best Sports Car of the Year in 2003, beating out the Enzo, the Carrera GT, and others. Then, it even made a spin-off version, the Exceed, which is basically the Elise, but hardtop with a bit of a wing. And again, the top-tier Cup 430 has a 424 horsepower supercharged Toyota V6. And it's similar specs, but you don't have that wind noise, and you get air conditioning. That's not from the outside. Now, Lotus wanted to appeal to the everyday consumer, kind of. So they made the Evora a 2+2 family-friendly Lotus. Kind of, again. It had enough room for the standard 2.2 children in the back, and its 3.5-liter V6 made 430 horsepower in the GT430 Sport model. That is a very fast 4-ish seater. And in fact, it wasn't just fast, it was the fastest Lotus they've ever made. 0 to 60 in 3.6 seconds and a top speed of a ridiculous 196 miles an hour. In a Lotus. That's absurd. 196 miles in 1 hour. And it still had brilliant steering on top of that. But as you might have noticed, those are the only 3 production models currently in Lotus's lineup, because they've been in what's called survival mode. They only have 1,400 employees working for them, and they were not doing financially well. So the Chinese company Geely bought them, and with that brand new injection of cash, they're hiring new employees, and they're developing new cars. A lot of new cars. Kicking it off with a SUV. That's right, a Lotus SUV. Now, if you're thinking that's uncommon, no, Lotus has been involved with a lot more than you'll ever think of. Let's just do a quick rundown, shall we? They done the chassis design for the Aston Martin DB9. They tuned up the Vauxhall Carlton to be the fastest sedan in the world. They tuned up the Talbot Sunbeam to be a world championship winning rally car. They made the Tesla Roadster. They helped out with the Toyota MR2 and the Toyota Supra. They have been involved in everything, and SUVs is just another box waiting to be ticked. And now they're actually making it themselves, so hopefully they can actually make some cash from it. But their crown jewel is a hypercar. Lotus's first hypercar, specifically an all-electric hypercar called the 130, which, if produced in time, it will be the first all-electric hypercar in British motoring history. And the CEO, Phil Popman, has said there could be several different cars with this new injection of cash. Sedans, GT cars, new sports cars, the SUV aforementioned. So, could this be a new renaissance for Lotus? Partially. You see, while Lotus may shine prosperously with actual profit, we'll see if that turns on to the racing scene, because that, let's be honest, is what Lotus is known for best. And if you're going to talk about Lotus and racing, there's only one sport that matters. Formula 1. Now, a TLDR of Lotus, if a quick look around the internet will find that they have won 7 Constructor Championships and 6 Driver Championships, and those drivers, by the way, have been absolute legends, just to name a few. Jim Clark, Graham Hill, Sterling Moss, Mario Andretti, Ayrton Senna, and that's just a few off-the-cuff names. Nigel Mansell have all competed in Lotuses. Why? One word. Innovation. Kicking it off in 1962 with the Type 25, the first ever monocoque chassis in Formula 1, which means it was lighter and stronger than any other Formula 1 car, which means it won double world titles with Jim Clark in 1963 and 1965, respectively, drivers and manufacturers. Then, they had another revolution with the Type 49, this time powered by a Cosworth V8, which is one of the most successful motor racing engines in all of Formula 1. And the Type 49 experimenting with aerodynamics, and a brand new stress member drivetrain, which makes it even lighter. These things weighed just 1,200 pounds and had almost 400 horsepower. And, oh yeah, it won double world titles again in 68 and 1970. Speaking of the 70s, the Type 72 was up next in the year of 1970. And this was by far one of the most revolutionary Formula 1 cars of its day. With brand new inboard brakes, side-mounted radiators, and a super streamlined aerodynamic wedge shape, meant it was the fastest and most innovative Formula 1 car in the world. And it was the most successful Lotus, by far, winning 3 Constructors' titles in 1970, 1972, and 1973, and it won the driver's title twice that same time. The year after that was the Type 78. After the mediocre success of the 77, the 78 came back and single-handedly started the ground effect revolution, making the air going underneath the car physically suck it to the road. And it had inverted wings to give it even more downforce. The radiator slits were shaped in such a way that even those little slits providing air to the engine could be used for aerodynamic downforce. And because all that air was still going past the car and underneath the car, it had low drag as well, meaning double world title. 1978 for drivers and manufacturers. And then they weren't so competitive. That doesn't mean they weren't innovative, but they weren't as competitive. We had to go back to the 1950s with the Type 56, an all-wheel drive Formula One car powered by a turbine engine, producing 500 horsepower with one gear. It was so fast and so good, it was not only banned from Formula One, but banned from the Indy 500 as well. Hence why it was not in the aforementioned list. Another banned car, this time being the Type 88 in 1981. It would have been the first Formula One car to be made out of all carbon fiber had it not been banned by the FIA for having its suspension and aero parts separate from the chassis. We don't know what that means, FIA. You're just wanting McLaren to take that instead of Lotus, you imbeciles. Anyway. Thanks to the new cash flow and plans for the business, will Lotus turn into the next McLaren? Possibly. We have no idea. Will they get back into Formula One? We don't know about that either. What we do know is, whatever they do, they will continue making brilliantly fast, mind-bogglingly good handling sports cars and supercars for years to come.